In 1944, Britain and its allies were successfully turning the tide against the Nazi war machine. With defeat looming, Adolf Hitler ordered for a secret weapon to be launched in a last-ditch attempt to thwart the Allies. The task of detecting and tracking this new threat fell to a specialist group of women. One of these women was Eileen Younghusband. Throughout the Second World War, Eileen and her fellow officers tracked many of Hitler's aerial forces, but none were as deadly as the V2 rockets. Carrying Hitler's wrath with them, the V2s left nothing but devastation in their wake. Eileen's wartime efforts took her beyond her native shores, as she played her small but significant part in restoring freedom to Europe and bringing down the tyrannical Third Reich. Under the Official Secrets Act, Eileen was unable to speak of her wartime operations. For over half a century, her story has been kept secret, until now. This is One Woman's War. Eileen Younghusband was born on American Independence Day, the 4th of July, 1921. From the age of 5, she lived in an Edwardian semi-detached house in the North London suburbs with her mother and father, her younger brother Dennis, and her mother's parents. She attended elementary school in Wychmore Hill before progressing to Southgate County School in 1932. Reflecting on how her parents helped to shape her, Eileen feels extremely fortunate to have had such loving parents.
My father was a cabinet maker and joiner, having done 5 years for his debentures, and he was a craftsman of the highest order. And not only that, he did everything. He cut our hair, he swept the chimneys, he mended things, he created things, he made toys for me. My mother, on the other hand, she was the only child, and she was brought up and was the mathematician of the family. And she eventually ran what was called the counting house in a couture shop in New Bond Street. And she took me to the library from a very early age. And because of that, I've always loved books and loved literature. And I think that's why probably I started writing. My father was very supportive. I can remember him taking me outside one day and showing me the firmament and showing me all the stars. And then he came in and he drew what he'd seen and marked them all up for me. That was when I was about 10 or 11.
Her parents encouraged her to pursue her dreams and never held her back. When discussing Eileen's potential employment in France, her mother said, "Just go for it," whilst her father simply said, "Follow your heart." 3 years after World War II, Eileen's beloved mother lost her long and arduous battle with cancer.
My father died many, many years later, and he was a smoker. He didn't die till he was 82 with cancer. It was quite strange because my mother never smoked.
Having completed her compulsory education in 1937, Eileen left school with high hopes and ambitious dreams. Eileen quickly found a job working at the Scottish Provident Institution. Located next to the Mansion House, directly opposite the Bank of England, and a stone's throw from the stock market, Eileen found herself working in one of the most important areas in the world. She was just 16 years old.
In the office, I was younger by far. I learnt a lot of quite good things from them. They trained me efficiently in office work. And because I was a woman, unfortunately, I was definitely an inferior body because all the other men were in beautiful suits, lovely ties. I was put in a scratchy maroon overall.
With the low prospect of progression at the Scottish Provident, Eileen was glad to receive an offer that was too good to refuse.
I was taught both German and French at school, and I was quite good at languages. And after matriculation, I got a distinction in French. And my German master then left school and started the school travel service. And the school travel service was the beginning of when children were taken in groups to stay overseas on the continent. And he was doing very well because he was really the initiator of this whole scheme. And he wrote to me within 6 months of me leaving school saying, Eileen, I'd like you to come and join my business. Would your parents allow you to? But it would mean you had to go to France for 6 months and then to Germany and polish up both those languages. So I spoke to my parents because although I quite enjoyed what I was doing in the city, I very soon realised that women were very much not accepted for any higher post, and I would always be an underling. So I decided that I would be very interested in this job, and that's how we set about trying to find a placement for me.
With the support from her parents and armed with a wealth of knowledge from her days as a girl guide, Eileen began searching for work on the continent. She spent weeks searching through a variety of ladies' magazines bought for her by her mother in order to find the most suitable placement.
In those days, we were looking for an au pair job. An au pair meant purely teaching English to possibly the children. Almost within the first month, we found an advertisement from someone living in Contrexéville in the Vosges Mountains, and we applied, and I had references from my headmaster and the minister at the Baptist church where I was a Sunday school teacher, and I was taken on straight away by this family.
Within 6 weeks, 16-year-old Eileen had left her job at the Scottish Provident and embarked on a journey to France alone.
I was met at the railway station by a rather distinguished-looking lady in a very expensive car with a chauffeur, and I was driven through the town of Contrexéville. I remember it's a very floral city, lots of gardens, and just on the outskirts we drove up a long drive to a very big house surrounded by woods. And we got to the front door and it was opened by a most distinguished-looking man who was my new employer.
Eileen spent the majority of her time in Contrexéville with the family's 3 children, Hélène, Jean and François. During this time, they always spoke in English.
They were very bright children. They learnt very, very quickly. And then in the afternoons, I would be allowed to take them out into the woods, and we played games like Robin Hood and all sorts of English games I taught them, hide and seek.
After only 3 months in Contrexéville, Eileen received some unsettling news.
In August, Monsieur Boucher, who was like a territorial with Les Chasseurs, was called up to camp, as I thought, for his annual training period. And off he went. And within 48 hours of him going to camp, and I believe it was at Strasbourg, he telephoned home, and his wife came in and found me and said, come into my office. And I thought I'd done something wrong. But when I got there, she said, I've got some bad news for you. My husband has just telephoned me to say that his camp is on the edge of the River Rhine and the Germans are all there in force in a demilitarized zone. They're not allowed to enter, but not only that, they've mined the river. He feels war is imminent and it's far too dangerous for you to stay. You must go home immediately.
Having heard nothing on the radio or read any related stories in the newspaper, Eileen was shocked to hear the news. With war looming, Eileen began to pack her belongings for her long journey home.
The children were most tearful and said, don't go, Eileen, don't go. But of course I had to go. I was taken to the station and I went alone in a very crowded train to Paris. And when I got there, it was too late for me to get the connection and I had to find somewhere to stay. And so I spoke to a gendarme that I found in the Boulevard Haussmann, and he took me to a refuge run by nuns. And they found a little side room for me to go into. I can remember that so clearly. There was a Bible, there was a table, there was a chair, and there was a bed, but that was all. I had no supper that night, but first thing in the morning I went to the refectory and we had a wonderful big bowl of hot coffee. We then had a croissant and some jam, and that was it, confiture. And then I had to make my way to the Gare du Nord and get a train. Difficult to find a seat because the train was already crowded with people bearing all sorts of suitcases, belongings tied up in curtains and pieces of old cloth. I couldn't understand what was happening. And then when I found a seat in a carriage, I heard them all talking in a form of German. And I realized that it was Yiddish, and these were all Jewish families who were more or less taking every chance they could to escape. They had fear written all over their faces. I realized they were in a terrible state. But it was interesting. As we gradually got to the coast, to Calais, their faces changed and the fear seemed to drain away. Sometimes they smiled, and gradually they started delving in their suitcases and bringing out their jewellery that they'd hidden. And they'd put on earrings and their brooches and their rings. And I realised that they suddenly felt that they were going to get to Britain and they would be safe.
Once back in England, Eileen knew she could no longer travel, but her words could. She'd been in contact with 2 young Germans during her time in France and continued to write to them from home.
One of them, Werner Eisner, was a little older than me, living in Berlin. And as the years went by, he was telling me how he was training to be a dentist. And he qualified just before war began. I also had another one called Hallie Stegemann, and she was quite different. She was pro-Hitler. She was always talking about the wonderful things that he'd done, and she joined the Hitler Jugend. Werner never mentioned anything about politics. He talked about books and music. Werner wrote several years before the war telling me that he had had to do his Arbeitsdienst, and this was a 6-month program that every German young man had to do, building roads and planting trees. I had no idea what this was going to lead to, but it wasn't till war started we found out that the object of this was for the troops to go through, and the trees were going to hide them from any enemy aircraft. When the war came, his very last letter arrived actually on September the 3rd. And he told me that he'd been called up into the infantry. I had absolutely no idea why a qualified dentist would be put in the infantry.
After the war, Eileen did not hear from either of her pen friends again. She was contacted by Werner's mother after a short while, but only to be informed, much to Eileen's confusion, that Werner had sadly been killed early in the conflict.
His mother wrote and said to me, "Were you all right? Werner was killed at Arras in 1940. He was cannon fodder." And I always wondered about that. I wrote to her, but I didn't like to ask. And finally, in 1980, I met his sister, Gea Eisner, and I asked that question: why was Werner cannon fodder, like your mother said? And she explained. It seems that they had Jewish blood in them from great-grandparents, not enough to be considered as people to wear the yellow star, but another category called second-class citizens. And he was put in the infantry so that he probably would be killed before the more hardened troops. Gea told me that she too was told to go and work at Auschwitz. She didn't go there as a prisoner, she went there as a clerk, and her job was to take notes, keep records of everything that the Jewish prisoners brought with them when they arrived in camp. The Germans are so methodical that those records have been kept even to this day.
In the late 30s, Britain was led by Neville Chamberlain, widely remembered for signing the Munich Agreement in 1938. This was an act which seemingly assured many across Europe that peace was finally within reach.
I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
And so the next year, because I'd been told I'd got to polish up my German if I wanted to do this new job that had been offered me, I got the chance to go and visit a factory in Germany at Merken bei Düren, and also go and stay with a load of students in Bonn for another further period. So I went. I was quite shocked in the factory because they were all they seemed to be subdued and very disciplined. Nobody seemed to smile or anything. And more than anything, I was absolutely shocked when I crossed the border into Germany that the train was entered by German soldiers and guards.
All of the passengers on board the train were subjected to a thorough inspection of their luggage and papers. Whilst being searched, Eileen was found in possession of an issue of Picture Post, which seemed to strike a nerve with the soldiers.
They took it away from me very angrily and said, "Verboten," forbidden. I couldn't think what there was in that magazine that was forbidden. Anyhow, I could see the look of fear on all the rest of the people in the carriage. They looked at me suspiciously.
This is London. You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Between the 7th of September 1940 and the 10th of May 1941, Britain and Northern Ireland were subjected to one of the worst airstrikes ever known. This relentless and unyielding attack became known as the Blitz.
Travelling up to London to my city office, every day the scene was different. Houses that were there yesterday wouldn't be there today. The whole of the front would be blown out. You could see the dining table all set, ready for a meal, and nobody there. The whole of the house open. And there would be people's possessions in the streets. Nobody was stealing them, they were just lying there. And that was the time when one of the biggest raids on London were made, and I used to go past St. Paul's Cathedral, and this was the day after the terrible bombing when there was a firestorm in that area. And amazingly, everything around St. Paul's Cathedral was destroyed, but still standing was its wonderful dome. It was an absolute miracle that it had been saved.
During the bombings, many people had sought refuge in the London Underground. They were not there, however, to avoid the occasional bombing raid. With their homes destroyed, they had no choice but to remain there. When the authorities learned of this, they assisted as best they could by providing metal bunk beds to ease the ordeal.
It was always crowded when I would travel, and there was barely room for us to stand because they had erected bunk beds for the people, and they were living underground completely. The little children never seemed to go outside, and they had old men's faces, yellow almost, because they were never in the fresh air. The families were cooking there on camping stoves. They were using the toilets just for washing, and so you can imagine the state they were all in. It was an incredible experience. People just having to take comfort of shelter wherever they could find it. When I arrived back sometimes from camp on a leave, I would arrive at the station, say Piccadilly Circus, and all the people who were sheltering there were amusing themselves by singing, and you could hear them all. They seemed quite happy, singing Roll Out the Barrel, There's Always Be in England, all the songs that Vera Lynn had been singing and keeping their spirits going. It was an amazing atmosphere. They would be joking with each other, and that was when the real spirit of a Cockney, the Cockney humour, would always be present, and it would keep them going despite the awful things that were happening to their city. Every day and every night, this sound, this aircraft sound, and you knew it was a German bomber because it sounded completely different from our own aircraft, which of course were mostly fighter engines. And then in the daytime, we would look up in the sky and see the dogfights. Even when I was away from London, evacuated, we were only a little way out of London, and we could see the dogfights, and we'd see an aircraft fall. And a funny thing is, you thought of it almost not quite like a game, but you didn't really think, when you saw the German bomber fall, you didn't think of the people inside it. No, certainly you didn't. You just thought, good, we won that one.
The Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or WAAF, was created on the 28th of June 1939. Women were accepted for the work ranging from catering to intelligence operations.
In the summer of June 1940, my very favourite cousin, Eric Padfield, a pilot, was killed. And I realised then I'd got to do something more than just helping canteens in my spare time. So I decided that as my father had been in the Royal Flying Corps and my cousin in the RAF, I would join the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And I sent in my application. On the day before I was going for my interview, I met a friend of mine, Mary True. We'd been friends, but also competitors in the sports field. And she was in a WAAF uniform. And I said to her, I've joined up and I'm going for my interview tomorrow. And she said, can I give you a bit of advice? They're sure to ask you whether you want to be a cook or a driver. Just tell them no. And she said, tell them you want to be a clerk, special duties. And I said, what's that? She said, I can't tell you. It's secret. But tell them you are good at mathematics.
Eileen attended her interview with the advice from Mary True still firmly in her mind. And sure enough, the first question asked was whether she wanted to be a cook or a driver. Eileen responded neither and informed the interviewer that she wanted to be a clerk, special duties.
I thought she was going to hit the ceiling. She said, how do you know about that? I said, I don't know anything about it, but my friend is one, and she told me I was to tell you I was good at mathematics. And that was the magic word. She immediately said, you will be a clerk, special duties. And that's how my life in the Royal Air Force started.
On joining the WAAF, Eileen was sent to an initiation camp in Innsworth, Gloucester, where she got to know her fellow recruits.
And it was a motley bunch of girls. They ranged from a vicar's daughter to public school girls to office clerks and prostitutes, all mixed together, and we would be put in a hut of about 28 to 30 people, not knowing who you were sharing the next bed with.
On her very first day, Eileen and her fellow WAF officers signed the Official Secrets Act, meaning they were unable to discuss their work for 30 years.
I don't know that the significance hit us immediately, but most certainly when our parents or our boyfriends or husbands asked us what we did and we said we can't tell you, then it did become quite difficult. I got married and within 5 to 6 weeks I was posted abroad. I was not able to tell my husband what I was doing before I was married to him or why I was being posted abroad, and he couldn't understand at all. In fact, I know he smuggled away in an aircraft to try and get over to Belgium to see me, but I'm afraid he was found.
Whilst on a special training course, Eileen began to learn of a new invention. Developed by Sir Robert Watson Watts in 1936, Eileen was introduced to the most effective defence system of its time, the radar chain.
After my 2 weeks initial training, I was then sent to Leighton Buzzard, and there I learned the secret of the radar chain. This was Watson Watts' wonderful invention, which would be the saving of Britain from invasion. I was taught the general rules of radar, and then I had special training as a filterer plotter. And the filter room was the link between the radar station and many other services. For example, the operations room, which would scramble aircraft to intercept, air raid warnings for the public, the Royal Observer Corps, who would take over the tracks that we were plotting and track them on overland. It would go to the air-sea rescue so that if any of our planes crashed, they would be picked up in the channel at the earliest possible time. And it was then I realised the importance of the filter room. And it is only now that is being revealed that it was the linchpin of the defence of Britain. We had so few aircraft, so few trained pilots, and not a lot of fuel. And therefore, the filter room was able to get them up at the last minute. And it was the pivotal part of our defence.
The filter rooms were located underground in large open spaces. They were never quiet and always stressful.
The plotters were all plugged into a radar station, and the radar stations interlinked throughout the whole of Great Britain. And this is the difference between British radar and the German radar. Their radar was much more advanced than ours, but they used them as individual items, whereas we used them as a chain. And any aircraft coming in were picked up by one or other, sometimes 2 or 3 of the radar stations. The plotters at the radar station would then put on a mapped table which represented the coast of the whole of Britain and the sea and over to the continent, and they would tell the estimated position, the estimated number of aircraft, and the estimated height of any aircraft in that area. It could be our own, it could be the enemy aircraft. All our own aircraft were fitted with a device called IFF, Identification Friend or Foe. And if that had been put on by the pilot, we knew it was a friendly aircraft.
Overlooking the filter room from a balcony was the movement's liaison section, who would monitor the movements of all friendly aircraft, except for those which had been damaged and came off course.
So with that information, the controller of the filter room looked at what was being displayed on the table, and the information that we were filtering, we turned into an arrow for position, and we put on a magnetized plaque what we considered the estimated height and number of the aircraft, and he would identify it as fighter, bomber, coastal command, or hostile. And on that information, which was being told by a teller, a girl also on the balcony, to varying different places. Air raid warnings were given. Interceptions were initiated from the fighter stations. The Air Sea Rescue went out and picked up any aircraft that ditched into the sea if they got the Mayday signal, which was an extra broad IF signal that the RAF were fitted with. And, of course, all sorts of other organisations. Winston Churchill's main room was notified, and when the Americans came in, their rooms were notified, and the artillery were notified.
The filterers would always arrive early for their shift. A handover was required as those finishing their watch were replaced. Since it was vital that the operations did not stop, each officer would be taken over in a quick relay formation.
So we tried to make certain that we were as wide awake as we possibly could. We would either go on duty at 8 in the morning or midnight or 4 in the afternoon. Once we got on the table, we immediately worked as a team. There was something about it. We realised that we were defending Great Britain, and it meant that to us. And in addition, it also meant that every plaque we had on the table was an aircraft, and it was doing a job, either against us or for us. These girls who knew the squadrons that were in the bombing raids would plot out 500, and perhaps only 450 would come back, and then 2 might struggle in and crash in the channel. These girls who had husbands, boyfriends, brothers, maybe in the squadrons that were being used that day, they never faltered, they continued their work, they never showed emotion. They were completely professional, and they never had hysterics, they never had any form of emotion. They just kept going. I cannot speak too highly of their dedication. Long before they ever happened, we'd all been warned that Hitler had got a secret weapon, and none of us really knew whether it was going to be a death ray or what form it would take. But I believe that our scientists got some idea, and the first one was an unmanned aircraft, and it was sent up from the Pas-de-Calais area, and that landed mostly on the London area and Kent. And we were able to plot that perfectly easily and filter it, and of course give the information to the guns for their target to be correct. I have seen a map of Kent where many were shot down or tipped down by the fighter aircraft, and most of them were shot down by the artillery before they even crossed the coast. And I would say it was almost 50% of those launched were destroyed before they hit London. That amount of V1s that were shot down might have landed on London or the other areas where there were lots of population. There would have been many, many more deaths if radar had not been able to pick them up and give this advance warning.
With the continued success of the filter room operations keeping the enemy on the back foot, Hitler gave the order to launch something new into the battlefield, the V2 rockets. These technologically advanced bombs were a terrible force. Aimed predominantly at London and Antwerp, their destructive potential was a terrifying reality.
And we were just told that the radar stations might get a signal of this new weapon. And if so, they would give the signal and say, Big Ben. And the first filterer officer to get that signal had to stand on a chair and shout it out 3 times. On September the 8th, 1944, one of the filterers in the filter room in Stanmore called out, "Ma'am, they say Big Ben." And I happened to be the person who heard it. And I stood up on a chair and I immediately shouted out, "Big Ben, Big Ben, Big Ben." All hell broke out in the filter room. The controller rang bells, people came in to see what was happening. Of course, you couldn't see anything because it was supersonic and it was far too fast. But that was the first V2 rocket that landed on September the 8th in Chiswick.
With the war at its peak, the RAF had been involved in some of the most devastating and casualty-heavy battles so far. New aircraft were needed, and fast. Spurred on by the government, all districts began to host events and invest money to be used solely on getting more planes in the air. The initiative was known as Wings for Victory. It was during a Wings for Victory event that Eileen's life took a romantic turn.
Each watch were asked to put on an event, and they put me in charge of a garden party for B-Watch. And we got all sorts of things going on, and then I suddenly thought perhaps the gentleman with the stables might lend us a couple of horses. And this he did very willingly, being ex-service. And when the whole event was over and we'd had a great success and raised the greatest amount of money, I went over and thanked him. And his son was there. His son was at RAF Northolt. He'd applied to be a pilot, but unfortunately he failed on his Morse code. And so he was now stationed at RAF Northolt as a physical training instructor. However, he also ran a dance band for the station, and on that day he tried to sell me the dance band for our officers' mess parties. And his father said, by the way, we've got a lake in our fields, if any of you girls want to use it. And that's what happened. I used to go up there and swim, and Peter came too quite often, and one thing led to another.
Eileen and Peter met in May. They were engaged in July and married in the September of the same year. After only 6 weeks of marriage, Eileen was told she was being sent abroad. In early December 1944, Eileen and 7 of her fellow officers were deployed to Belgium, tasked with a mission of the utmost importance.
It was an interesting job. The 8 of us were divided into 4 watches again, 2 officers on each watch. We were all women, once more women only, and we had 1 WAF sergeant with us each time, and we worked in the bank opposite the officers' mess. And our job was to track where the V2s had been launched from.
The V2 rockets were carried on and launched from lorries. When dispatched from their base, the lorries would be driven into wooded areas or beaches to remain out of sight. The dispersal time for the lorries was a mere 25 minutes. It was in this short time that Eileen and other WAF girls would have to locate them.
So what we had to do, once we knew a rocket had landed, we called that the fall of shot. We then had to extrapolate the curve of the rocket. In other words, go right the way through the curve to where it was launched. The only assistance we had was a mobile number 9 radar station was able to pick up the very top of the curve, I assume when the actual speed was slightly less than the supersonic speed. And with that piece of information, and with the use of a slide rule and what we could remember of trigonometry, we would extrapolate the curve to the launch site.
The young WAF officers had only 6 minutes to complete their calculations. This information was then sent to intelligence, where it would be coupled with sound recordings from Army survey units. It was finally passed on to the nearby Mosquito bombers, who were then dispatched to the launch site location.
We managed to destroy all the lorries by the end of February, beginning of March 44. Hitler was not keeping up with the production of the launching lorries in time to replace them. And by that time, our troops were moving on to the launching areas, which were in the north of Rotterdam.
On the 8th of May 1945, Adolf Hitler's Third Reich came to an end. The Allied forces of World War II accepted the surrender of the Nazi army, and the day became known as Victory in Europe Day.
By May in 1945, most of the V2 rockets had been destroyed, and we were very quiet at night. We knew peace must be on its way. And on the morning of May the 8th, I came off duty at 8 o'clock in the morning, having had a very quiet night, and was about to cross the road to the officers' mess for breakfast. And at that very moment, a little black car came to a sudden halt right in front of me, and out jumped two officers wearing pilot's wings. And they grabbed me and hugged me and said, "You are the first English woman we have seen since 1940. And then I noticed on the wings of the car the letters PWX, ex-prisoners of war. And they had left their camp 5 days before, when the guards were beginning to leave and disappear in case they were captured. And they managed to steal one of the SS cars, and they decided to make their escape. They would only travel at night because they didn't know what areas had yet been freed by the Allies. And they would steal petrol from the tractors in the farms. All they could find to eat would be things in the field like mangel wurzels or turnips. And they quietly made their way a few miles every day. And this was the morning when they got into Belgium and realised that it had already been liberated. And when they saw me, they were absolutely delirious with happiness. So I immediately took them over to the officers' mess, and they had an enormous breakfast. And then the CO said to me, "Eileen, find out what they really would like to do now." And do you know what they said? "We would like to go back to Rotterdam and find the nurses. We were rescued out of our plane when we crashed, and these two nurses saved us, and otherwise we would have been burnt. And we would like to go back to that hospital and take them some food." And the CO said, "Fine, go to the kitchens and fill up a big box." And this is what we did. And with another WAF officer, I got in the car with these two pilots, and we returned back into Holland and made our way towards Rotterdam. We got to the edge of the river, and we found we could not cross because the bridge over to Rotterdam itself had been blown up. As we stood on the bank, we saw a ferryman arriving, and he'd got a flat-bottomed boat. And so we said, "Could we come over to Rotterdam with you?" And he said, "I'm sorry, the river is mined, and if I took you with me, we would be hitting the mines. I can go alone and pick up things, but I can't take anyone with me." So we gave him the food, and we gave him the address of the nurses, and he promised that he would deliver it. I often wonder whether it ever got to them, because after all, food was so valuable, and the black market would have given him a lot of money. When we got back, the CO said, "You've been up over 36 hours. You ought to go to bed now." And the medical officer gave me a sleeping tablet. So, feeling quite tired, I went back to my billet and I got into bed. And then I thought, this is absolutely stupid. It's VE day. I'm not going to bed. So I got up, put on a clean shirt, and went back to the mess, because everyone there were going into Brussels to celebrate. And the medical officer, when he saw me, he said, "Oh, I thought you'd be back." And he said, "You better take this." And he gave me a Benzedrine. And so I went to Brussels in this little car with the two pilots and two other WAF officers. And we were feted. We were given wine and flowers and cakes. And it was a wonderful time. At the beginning, I was really quite sleepy. And then as everybody else was tiring, by midnight, the Benzedrine had kicked in and I was full of beans. And that was the first and only time that I have ever had a downer and an upper.
With the war over, Eileen believed she would be sent home to her husband, whom she had not seen for almost a year. Instead, she received a mission that remains with her to this very day.
After peace had been declared, we all thought we would be going home, but several of us were kept on to help Belgium get back on its feet. Because I was fluent in French, I was given a special task. I was told I was going to be taken to Breendonk, and I had no idea what was in store for me.
Built in 1906, Fort Breendonk was initially part of a defence ring designed to withstand a German attack. The fort surrendered in 1914 following the fall of Antwerp. Midway through World War II, the fort was transformed into a prisoner camp. Although Fort Breendonk is not significant in the long list of concentration camps, it was no less ruthless in its narrow-minded perversity or its denial of humanity.
Breendonk was known as the camp of silence and of death, and it was one of the only concentration camps in Belgium. It had started as a holding camp for Jews prior to being sent to Auschwitz, but as they captured resistance fighters and homosexuals and gypsies, it turned into a horrific place. And when a German commandant took over, Herr Schmidt, it was a place of cruelty and of death. I went there every day for 3 weeks. I was told that I would have to take airmen and show them the horrific and cruel things that had happened within its walls. I would show them the punishment cells where people had had their hands manacled to the wall and their feet chained to the wall. And the hands would be loosened only when they were being fed. And they would push the food through a cat hole in the door, and the prisoner would have to lie down and eat it from the floor like an animal. On the walls, they would have scratched things with their nails, messages, pictures, and sometimes the amount of time they'd be there, there would be a scratch for every day of the week, 6 scratches and 1 across for the 7th, the end of another week. There was one particular message I remember seeing. Betrahi par ma maîtresse, Léonardine Boisson of Courtrai. Betrayed by my mistress, Léonardine Boisson of Courtrai. And he was one of the resistance fighters. What happened to him, I will never know. Outside, there were the wooden posts that some of the prisoners had been tied to and shot. And in the torture room, there was an enormous big table with a butcher's block on top. And the prisoner would be laid there, and electric current would be put into all his damp orifices until he collapsed. And then he would be put on a truckle bed. And the slats of that bed were all broken, I noticed. And this was when the jackboots of the guards would stamp on their legs in order to bring them back to consciousness. But the really cruel part of that was there was a short wall at the entrance, and the next prisoner to be tortured would be placed behind that wall. They couldn't see what was going on. They could just hear the terrible sounds. This was Breendonk, the camp of silence and of death.
Since the war, Eileen has had success in a variety of different fields, from hotel management to supplying scrap metal to a company in Spain. In 1983, Eileen moved to Sully in South Wales, where she has lived ever since. At the age of 87, she graduated from the Open University, where she was awarded the honour of Student of the Year. Eileen is now a successful author, a recognised TV personality, and an active campaigner on health and education issues.
Well, my contribution was one of many done by women in varying sorts of jobs. But I do feel the girls of the filter room have never been mentioned. We all see the ops room, which is the girls pushing the finished information round, which wasn't terribly difficult compared with the job the filter rooms were doing. And as far as I'm concerned, the girls of the filter room should be mentioned and should get a little of the honour and glory they deserve. I went in as a naive, late teenager. I came out a very different person. My character was formed by the war years. The discipline, the feeling of not letting things happen, but getting up and doing something about it. The feeling that people mattered and peace was important. And whatever happened, not just sit down and let things roll over. If you can do anything to contribute, to do it.
Without the incredible work done by the women of the WAF, the Second World War may have ended differently. They will all be remembered for their bravery and commitment to freedom. Heroes like Eileen are owed our eternal gratitude and thanks for the sacrifices they made all those years ago.